the town that tried to fence the Windy in the spring of 1888. The people of Dry Creek believed they had done something no generation before them had managed to do. They believed they had tamed the frontier, not defeated it, not survived it, tamed it. The town stood on a hard, sun-whitened stretch of eastern Wyoming where the grass rolled away in every direction like a faded sea. A few years earlier, there had been almost nothing there but antelope trails, buffalo bones, and the memory of fires moving across the plains at night. Now Dry Creek had a hotel with a false front, a general store that sold canned oysters and lamp oil, a blacksmith shop, 2 saloons, a church with an unfinished steeple, and a stock association determined to turn open country into orderly wealth. The men who ran that association spoke a new language of empire. They spoke of acreage, fencing rights, breeding ratios, rail access, eastern capital, winter reserves, and market timing. They measured the prairie not in wonder, but in output. Grass became inventory. Water became leverage. Distance became profit. Even the wind, that old unruly sovereign of the plains, seemed to them no more than an inconvenience that rattled a window or bent a hat brim. They had money behind them. Now Chicago money, St. Louis money, New York money. Investors who had never smelled wet saddle leather or heard a steer ball in the dark were buying the West by telegram. In polished offices 1,000 miles away, men with soft hands and clean cuffs studied maps and concluded that the future of American beef lay not in Texas alone, but farther north, where the land was cheap. The horizons were endless, and the old buffalo range seemed to promise a fortune to anyone bold enough to claim it. So Dry Creek grew quickly, and like many frontier towns that grow too quickly, it began to confuse activity with permanence. New corrals appeared along the creek bottom. Long strings of barbed wire spread across the range, glittering under the sun like knife edges. Wells were dug. Hay was cut where it could be cut. A few ambitious men planted cottonwoods as if shade itself could be summoned by determination. Eastbound cattle trains began leaving on a schedule that made the town feel connected to history's main current, instead of stranded beyond it. Every fresh board nailed into place, every new roof raised against the sky, every ledger filled with figures that climbed in the right direction seemed to declare the same thing. This country is ours now. But the land had not agreed to any such arrangement. That summer gave its warning in ways both subtle and unmistakable. The creeks shrank early. Dust rose too easily beneath wagon wheels. The grass cured before its time, turning from green to yellow, then from yellow to the color of old paper. Ranch hands riding the outer edges of the range noticed that cattle wandered farther each week to feed. Horses came in with their heads low. Coyotes grew bold enough to show themselves in daylight. Old men, those rare men who had lived on the plains long enough to distrust good seasons, watched the sky with narrowed eyes and said very little. One of them was a trail-worn foreman named Elias Boone, whose face looked as if it had been cut from walnut wood and left out in the weather. Boone had driven cattle north from Texas, buried men after river crossings gone bad, and spent enough winters outdoors to know that the plains kept accounts in their own way. He was not educated, but he possessed the kind of intelligence that can only be earned where mistakes are punished immediately and often. Fatally, in late September, he rode into town with alkali, dust on his boots, and told the president of the stock association that the herds were too thin, the hay reserves too small, and the fences too numerous. Too numerous. The man asked with a smile. Too many fences, Boone said. For a hard winter. The president shung, tailored, ambitious. And Eastern, even after 3 years in Wyoming, laughed as though he had just been offered a ghost story in broad daylight. Fences were progress. Fences meant control. Fences meant private order replacing public chaos. Fences kept competitors out and assets in. That, at least, was the theory. And theories in Dry Creek were doing very well that year. Boone did not argue. Men like him seldom wasted words on people who preferred confidence to evidence. But before he left the office, he looked once through the window toward the pale horizon and said, "When the snow comes sideways, wire won't stop it." By November, many had forgotten the remark. Then the first storm arrived. It came low and fast across the prairie with a violence that made the town seem provisional again. Snow drove through cracks, in walls, under doors, through stable slats, into bedrolls and flour sacks, and to folded collars of coats hanging near the stove. The temperature fell so quickly that water buckets skimmed over with ice before dawn. In the open country, cattle bunched and turned their backs to the wind. By morning, drifts had already formed against the wire fences in long white ridges. The storm passed. For a few days, Dry Creek behaved as frontier towns always did after danger briefly withdrew. It boasted. Men in the saloons slapped each other on the back, cursed the weather with theatrical contempt, and drank to their own toughness. Teamsters hauled freight again. Poker games resumed. The hotel parlor filled with cigar smoke and opinions. It was decided that the storm had been severe, yes, but not exceptional. Nothing, after all, had yet happened that could not be explained away. Then came a second storm, and then another. December closed like a fist. The snow no longer fell in picturesque sheets, but in hard, needling bursts that stripped the heat from a man's face in minutes. The wind began to shape the country into traps. Gullies filled. Trails vanished. Fence lines disappeared beneath drifts until only the top wire showed, humming in the gale like taut strings. Cattle drifted before the storms because that is what cattle do, moving with the force that opposes them least. And when they met the fences, they packed against them by the hundreds. There they stood, pressed shoulder to shoulder, steaming, bawling, freezing. The strong climbed over the weak. The weak sank and were trampled. Snow piled over backs, then necks, then horns. When the blizzard eased, riders sent out from the ranches found the wire lines marked not by posts, but by dark frozen mounds stretching for half a mile at a time. Dry Creek was not prepared for this kind of arithmetic. The Stock Association had counted its wealth by the 1,000 head in autumn. Now, every day, subtracted from those figures. Men who had once argued over expansion plans began arguing over blame. Some said the problem was overstocking. Some said it was the fences. Some blamed foreign investors. Some careless foreman. Some God. A few even blamed the very idea common in those years and deadly in retrospect that the northern plains could support unlimited ambition so long as a man possessed enough capital and enough nerve. Yet the catastrophe was larger than any one error. For 2 decades the cattle kingdom had been built on a chain of assumptions. That grass was free, that winters could be endured, that distance could be overcome by railroads, that the buffalo country could be inherited without consequence, that climate would respect business plans, and that men armed with ledgers, wire, and confidence could impose a lasting order on a landscape that had ruined stronger certainties than theirs. Now those assumptions were dying in the snow by January. Hunger entered the town as surely as the coal had. Not human hunger at first, but the terrible visible hunger of animals. Half-starved steers wandered down from the range and nosed at stable doors. Cows chewed fence posts, wagon tongues, and the tar paper peeled from outbuildings. Horses, ribs showing, pawed through the drifts for anything still living beneath them. At night the townspeople lay awake, listening to the long, broken bawling of cattle in the dark and new, with a helplessness more painful than fear. Then most of those sounds would be gone by morning, and still the storms returned. Years later, the survivors would disagree about figures, as survivors often do. They disputed temperatures, losses, and dates. Men inflate, forget, defend themselves. But on the essential point, There was no disagreement at all. The winter broke something larger than herds. It broke the illusion. When the thaw finally came, it revealed a country that looked less like a ranching empire than a battlefield after the army had gone. Carcasses lay in creek beds, undercut banks, along fence lines, and out across the open range where the snow had preserved them in grotesque attitudes of effort and surrender. Here and there, where starving animals had crowded around hay yards or sheltering draws. The dead lay so thick that riders had to pick their way through them. The smell carried for miles. Ravens gathered. Wolves returned, dotting Dry Creek. Men walked more quietly than they had the year before. The hotel still stood. So did the store, the smithy, the church without a steeple. The ledgers still existed, and the telegraph still clicked, and trains still ran east with hides and whatever gaunt survivors could be shipped. But something in the town's bearing had altered. The people who remained no longer talked as easily about mastering the frontier. They had seen plainly the difference between occupying a country and understanding it. This is a story of that town, of the men who tried to fence the wind, and of the winter that taught them what the West had been trying to say all along. The plains were never empty. They were never passive. And they were never, not even for a single season, under human control.